If you're flying above it and see its boundaries from the air, you'll find it's bordered on the west by Philadelphia and on the east by New York City. Benjamin Franklin said New Jersey was like a barrel tapped at both ends by these great metropolitan markets.
The Fence Post Rebellion, a clash of cultures and claims. In the mid-17th century, the New Jersey landscape was a stage for a complex drama involving European colonists, Native Americans, and competing claims to land and power. The Fence Post Rebellion was more than just a series of skirmishes over property lines. It was a clash of cultures, ideologies, and aspirations. Before the arrival of European settlers, the Lenape Native Americans had inhabited the region for centuries. However, with the arrival of the Dutch and English, this delicate balance was disrupted. In 1664, King Charles II granted a vast tract of land, including what would become New Jersey, to his brother, the Duke of York. The Duke, in turn, bestowed the territory upon Lord John Berkeley and Sir George Carteret. This grant, however, conflicted with earlier land claims made by Governor Richard Nichols of New York. Nichols had granted land in the Elizabethtown area to settlers from Long Island, who had purchased the land from the Lenape. These settlers, primarily Puritans, believed they had a legitimate claim to the land based on their purchase and the authority of the New York government. When Philip Carteret, governor of New Jersey, arrived in Elizabethtown, he asserted the authority of the proprietors and demanded that the settlers repurchase their land and pay quit rents. This demand was met with fierce resistance. The ensuing conflict, known as the Fence War, was a symbolic battle over land ownership and self-governance. Settlers like Ebenezer Lyon, Benjamin Bond, John Ogden, and Luke Watson led the resistance, building and tearing down fences as a means of defiance. These physical acts were a manifestation of a deeper struggle over power and identity. The Elizabethtown Associates, a group of influential settlers, challenged the proprietors' authority and formed their own local government. They argued that their purchase from the Lenape gave them a superior claim to the land. The conflict was further complicated by the involvement of figures like Governor Andrew Hamilton, who sought to enforce the proprietors' claims, and Lewis Morris, a wealthy landowner with shifting allegiances. The Fence War was a generational conflict involving multiple generations of families. It highlighted the social and economic divisions within the colony, pitting the modest original settlers against the wealthier aristocrats who received land grants from the proprietors. While the Fence War eventually subsided, its legacy continued to shape the development of New Jersey.
England, June 24th, and years of Cromwell are gone, and the fastidiously dressed and bewigged gentlemen of the court are once again in power. Here are gathered today His Royal Highness James, Duke of York, brother of King Charles II, and two court favorites, John, Lord Berkeley, Baron of Stratton, and Sir George Carteret of Sultrams, who as governor of the Isle of Jersey had sheltered the Duke. Sir William Coventry, secretary and advisor to the Duke, is also present for this historic day. This is a day when the eyes of Englishmen are looking toward a new continent across the sea, America. Before this day is over, James will give to Berkeley and Carteret all the land lying between Manhattan Island and the Delaware Bay and River to the south and west. Recalling Carteret's stout defense of the Isle of Jersey for King Charles, the Duke also this day decreed that this gift of land should be called New Jersey.
The fence post-rebellion was a complex legal dispute involving land ownership and governance in New Jersey during the 17th century. The core of the conflict was the competing claims to land in the Elizabethtown area.
The fence war as a battle of boundaries is particularly striking. Our understanding of this period is based on fragmented and sometimes biased sources. It's important to be cautious about accepting any single narrative as definitive. While pinpointing exact participants in every fence-related incident is difficult, the following individuals and families were prominent in the resistance to the proprietors: the Elizabethtown Associates. This was a group of original settlers who received the Nichols Patent and were the most fervent defenders of their land rights. Ebenezer Lyon, a major leader of the resistance. He was constantly involved in legal battles with the proprietors and was even jailed for a period because of his outspoken opposition. He was a key figure in the resistance to quit rents. Benjamin Bond, another prominent leader and associate of Ebenezer Lyon. He was equally active in challenging the proprietors' claims and advocating for the rights of the original settlers. John Ogden, one of the original patentees. Luke Watson, a vocal opponent of the proprietors. Jeffrey Jones. Morse Moss family. This family was heavily involved, with members like Joseph Morse and Anthony Morse appearing in records related to the disputes. Marsh family. Members of the Marsh family, such as Samuel Marsh, are also mentioned in connection with the land conflicts. Wood family. This is another family name that appears in the records of disputes, suggesting their involvement in the resistance. Tremblay family. Members of this family were also likely involved, as the name appears in connection with Elizabethtown during this period. Baker family. The Baker family was a prominent early family in Elizabethtown and is likely to have been involved in the disputes. Other notable names. Governor Andrew Hamilton. He was a proprietary governor after Carteret who attempted to enforce the collection of quit rents, leading to increased tensions. Lewis Morris, a prominent landowner and political figure who sometimes sided with the proprietors and sometimes with the settlers, adding another layer of complexity to the situation. He would later become a royal governor. As mentioned before, the riots were often more about legal challenges, protests, and acts of defiance than widespread violence. There were instances of physical altercations, but nothing that would constitute a large-scale revolt. The disputes spanned decades, so multiple generations of the same families were often involved. The records from this period are not exhaustive. There were undoubtedly many other individuals involved whose names have been lost to time. While the disputes were primarily about land ownership, they also reflected broader social and economic divisions in the colony. The original settlers, often of modest means, felt threatened by the wealthier, more aristocratic individuals who received land grants from the proprietors.
Conflicting land grants. Nichols Patent. Governor Richard Nichols of New York granted land to settlers from Long Island, who had purchased the land from the Lenape Native Americans. Philip Carteret, governor of New Jersey, granted land to his associates, overlapping with the land granted by Nichols. Carteret demanded that the settlers pay quit rents, a form of land tax, to the proprietors. The settlers argued that they were not obligated to pay quit rents, as they had purchased the land from the Lenape and were under the jurisdiction of New York. The settlers and the proprietors engaged in a series of legal battles in both New York and New Jersey courts. The legal arguments focused on the validity of the land grants, the jurisdiction of the courts, and the rights of the settlers. The legal battles were complex and protracted. Ultimately, the proprietors' claims were upheld, and the settlers were forced to pay quit rents or repurchase their land. However, the conflict highlighted the tensions between colonial authorities and settlers, and it foreshadowed the larger struggles for self-governance that would lead to the American Revolution.
Richard Nichols. The name echoes through the halls of early American history, a man who, with a stroke of his quill, shaped the destiny of what we now know as New Jersey. In 1664, this English governor, a staunch royalist in service to the Duke of York, set his sights on the Dutch colony of New Netherland. He arrived with a fleet of warships, a show of force that quickly led to the peaceful surrender of New Amsterdam, soon to be christened New York in honor of his patron. But Nichols's ambition extended beyond the bustling island of Manhattan. He saw opportunity in the fertile lands across the Hudson, a place where English settlers could establish a foothold and expand the burgeoning empire. And so, he granted a patent to a group known as the Elizabethtown Associates, granting them the right to purchase and sell a vast tract of land west of the Arthur Kill. These associates, primarily Puritans seeking religious freedom and economic opportunity, hailed from New England and Long Island. They were a determined lot, driven by the promise of a new life in a new world. Among them were names like John Ogden, a carpenter and builder who would leave his mark on the fledgling settlement. With the stroke of a pen, the landscape of New Jersey was forever altered. The Elizabethtown Associates, the first to receive official sanction to settle this land, established their presence. They founded Elizabethtown, a town that would become the first capital of the province, a beacon of English influence in the untamed wilderness. But their journey was not without its challenges. Land disputes arose, legal battles ensued, as the associates clashed with the proprietors over ownership and control. Yet they persevered, their legacy woven into the very fabric of New Jersey's history.
Part 2.
The Fence War and the broader resistance to proprietary rule in Elizabethtown are seen as early examples of colonial resistance to perceived injustices and assertions of local autonomy. They foreshadowed the larger conflicts over land, taxation, and self-government that would eventually lead to the American Revolution. The disputes led to numerous court cases, further solidifying the importance of legal challenges to authority in the American colonies, although many of these cases would not be resolved until long after the Revolutionary War. The Puritan background of many Elizabethtown settlers likely played a role in their resistance. They had a strong belief in individual rights and a tendency to challenge authority they deemed unjust. Legitimacy of the Elizabethtown Purchase. The fact that the Elizabethtown settlers had a deed from Mattano and Warinanco, even if it was the second sale, strengthens their claim to the land, at least from a certain ethical perspective. It wasn't simply a matter of squatting or taking land without any agreement. They believed they had engaged in a legitimate transaction. It's crucial to consider why Mattano and Warinanco might have agreed to sell the land a second time. Several factors could have been at play. The growing power of the English colonies likely put pressure on the Lenape, making it difficult to refuse a sale. There may have been internal divisions or leadership changes within the Lenape that influenced the decision. There could have been fundamental differences in how the two cultures understood the nature of land ownership and the terms of the agreement. The concept of selling land outright and permanently relinquishing all rights to it might have been foreign to the Lenape. The Lenape did not keep the concept of land ownership on the personal level. Their settlements cultivated a culture of common use within tribes' territory. Even so, the propaganda that they did not see or understand sales and transfers of land is as erroneous as the Indian giver trope. On the tribal level, such as the settlement territorial boundaries, treaties and transfers were as common among people in the Western Hemisphere as was across the pond. American tribal nations are complex societies, and though some cultural aspects transcend tribal divisions, many do not. These nations are different cultures. Pretending the dynamic before outlanders was a utopia of spiritual oneness is not only untrue. This kind of ignorant soft racism is far worse than anything the Elizabethtown settlers as a whole did during colonization. This episode is directly connected to the origin of the offensive and inaccurate Indian giver trope. This phrase arose from the European perspective that once land was sold, it should remain sold, regardless of any subsequent changes in circumstances or power dynamics. The Indian giver trope. Misunderstandings. This perspective failed to understand the different ways in which indigenous peoples often viewed land ownership and transactions, which were often more about shared use and relationships than permanent alienation of property in the European sense. It also ignored the fact that this land had been sold multiple times. So singling out the Lenape tribe for this particular slight is all the more erroneous. Unlike many other colonial settlements, Elizabethtown did not experience significant conflict with the local Lenape. This suggests that despite the double sale of land, some degree of understanding or accommodation may have been reached between the settlers and the tribe, at least for a time. The settlers honored their purchase, and the tribe had likely already been displaced further inland as a result of previous interactions with Europeans. The involvement of the Lenape in the double sale makes the Elizabethtown conflict even more morally complex. It's not simply a case of settlers versus proprietors. It also involves the displacement and dispossession of indigenous people, even if the initial interaction between settlers and the Lenape was relatively peaceful in this particular instance. The Fence War in Elizabethtown remains a significant example of early colonial resistance to authority, but the added context of the land purchase from the Lenape highlights the deeper issue of European colonization and its impact on indigenous peoples. The settlers' claim to the land was based on a purchase from the Lenape, but this purchase itself was part of a larger process of dispossession driven by the expanding power of the English colonies. The episode serves as a reminder that even seemingly straightforward conflicts over land ownership in the colonial period often have complex layers involving multiple actors, competing claims, and underlying injustices rooted in the fundamental clash between classes and cultures. In conclusion, while we can't create a definitive list of every person involved in every incident, Marsh, Morse, Tremblay would, along with Lyon, Bond, Ogden, Watson, Jones, and others, represent families and individuals who were central to the Elizabethtown settlers' resistance against the proprietors' land claims. They were the key figures in a decades-long struggle over land rights, self-governance, and the very nature of colonial society in early New Jersey. The Lenni Lenape and the Fence Post Rebellion, why the legal judgment may have been wrong. Warinanco and Mattano were prominent chiefs of the Lenni Lenape tribe during the 17th century. They played significant roles in the land transactions with European settlers. Warinanco and Mattano, along with another chief named Seuakheons, signed the deed for the Elizabethtown Tract in 1664. This tract included about 500,000 acres of land between the Passaic and Raritan Rivers and the Arthur Kill. This land was sold to a group of English settlers from Long Island, marking an important transaction in the early history of New Jersey. The initial sale of land by the Lenape to the Dutch occurred in the early 17th century. The Dutch West India Company established a colony of New Netherland, which included parts of present-day New York, New Jersey, and Delaware. The Lenape, also known as the Delaware Indians, were among the first indigenous peoples to engage in trade with the Dutch settlers. In 1626, the Lenape sold the island of Manhattan to the Dutch in exchange for trade goods such as cloth, beads, and tools. This transaction is famously known as the Purchase of Manhattan, although the exact terms and fairness of the deal are subjects of historical debate. The Lenape engaged in further land transactions with the Dutch as European settlement expanded. These early interactions were primarily based on trade and mutual benefit. But as the Dutch sought more land for agriculture and settlement, tensions began to rise. The Dutch established fortified settlements, such as the one at Wildwick, which led to conflicts like the Esopus Wars in the mid-17th century. The fairness of the sale of Manhattan is a topic of much debate among historians. The commonly cited story is that in 1626, Peter Minuit, the director of the New Netherland colony, purchased Manhattan from the Lenape people for 60 guilders, which has often been translated to about $24 worth of beads and trinkets. However, this narrative is more complex and murkier than it seems. Here are some key points to consider. 1. Value of 60 guilders. The 60 guilders mentioned in the Dutch records would be worth approximately $951 in today's currency, not $24. This means the transaction was not as economically insignificant as often portrayed. 2. Lack of documentation. There is no surviving deed from the original transaction, and the letter from Dutch merchant Peter Schage does not specify who exactly made the deal on behalf of the Lenape. This leaves room for speculation about whether the Lenape fully understood the implications of the sale, or if they were taken advantage of. 3. Cultural misunderstandings. The concept of land ownership was different for the Lenape compared to European settlers. The Lenape may have viewed the transaction as a temporary transfer of usage rights rather than a permanent sale of land. 4. Context of the deal. The Dutch were expanding their colony and needed land for settlement and trade. The Lenape, facing pressure from European encroachment, might have agreed to the deal to secure immediate benefits, such as trade goods, without fully grasping the long-term consequences. 5. Historical interpretations. Some historians argue that the Dutch may have exploited the Lenape's lack of understanding of European legal concepts, while others believe the Lenape willingly engaged in the transaction for mutual benefit. In summary, while the sale of Manhattan is often simplified as a transaction for beads and trinkets, the reality is more nuanced. The fairness of the deal is questioned due to differences in cultural perspectives, the value of the goods exchanged, and the lack of clear documentation. Is it possible that Mattano and Warinanco, whom sold some of the same land again to the English settlers, did so as they believed rightful claim to the land after the Dutch capitulation to the English? That's an insightful perspective. It's quite possible that Mattano and Warinanco, having experienced the Dutch capitulation to the English, believed that selling the land again to the English settlers was a fair agreement. By this time, they might have had a clearer understanding of European concepts of land ownership and the implications of such transactions. The Lenape's decision to sell the land a second time could have been influenced by several factors. 1. Changing power dynamics. The shift in control from the Dutch to the English might have made the Lenape more cautious and strategic in their dealings. 2. Seeking stability. By selling the land to the English, they might have hoped to secure a more stable and predictable relationship with the new colonial power. 3. Economic pressures. The need for trade goods and other resources could have driven the Lenape to make agreements that they believed would benefit them in the long run. This perspective adds another layer of complexity to the historical narrative, highlighting the adaptive strategies of the Lenape in response to European colonization. It also underscores the importance of understanding the context and motivations behind their actions. I would have to believe they did, and that the eventual judgment in the fence post rebellion siding with the proprietors was incorrect. It's certainly a perspective worth considering. Given the changing political landscape and the Lenape's evolving understanding of European land transactions, it's plausible that Mattano and Warinanco believed they were making a fair agreement the second time around. Their decision might have been influenced by their desire to secure a more stable relationship with the new English authorities and to ensure their people's well-being. If this was indeed the perspective of the Lenape leaders and understood by Nichols, as well as the Elizabethtown associates, this would mean the land was independently acquired for the British Crown by the company and not by the Duke of York via Nichols, albeit the acquisition of said land was authorized by Nichols, meaning the Duke would have ultimately authorized the independent acquisition of the Elizabethtown Tract to the Company of Associates. Thus, the proprietor's rights over the land later dictated by the Duke of York is a transfer, and the associates by British law would have been entitled to a fair price for the land, as the preceded decree ensured their right of ownership. The judgment forcing the settlers to repurchase and or submit to paying quit rents on the properties they claimed is illegal. The correct order coming from this viewpoint would be the cancel of repurchase and quit rent as fair payment to the settlers for the Duke of York's then legal transfer to the proprietors. Would this have settled the matter? No one can ever know. However, it would have been legal. The judgment in the fence post rebellion siding with the proprietors reflects the complexities and biases of colonial legal systems at the time. It's possible that the settlers' rights and the Lenape's perspectives were not fully considered or understood by the colonial authorities. This viewpoint adds depth to the historical narrative, highlighting the adaptive strategies and resilience of the Lenape in navigating European colonization. It's a reminder that history is often more nuanced than it appears at first glance.
1. Legitimacy of the Elizabethtown Purchase. The fact that the Elizabethtown settlers had the Nichols Grant, as well as a deed from Mattano and Warinanco. This was the Lenape's second sale of the land, first to the recently conquered Dutch. Remember this point for later. Overall, these lend a strong claim to the associates' ownership of the land, at least initially from a certain ethical perspective. It wasn't simply a matter of squatting or taking land without any agreement. They believed all parties had engaged in a legitimate transaction.
In the 17th century, New Jersey was a hotspot of competing land claims. King Charles II granted the territory to his brother, the Duke of York, who in turn sanctioned Governor Richard Nichols of New York to issue patents. The Elizabethtown Associates, a group of diverse settlers, received the Nichols patent, allowing them to purchase land from the Lenape leaders. This transaction recognized the Lenape's original claim and aimed to secure a foothold in the region through deed, thus establishing a self-governing company colony under James, Duke of York, via Nichols' patent. The Elizabethtown Associates believed the patent provided them autonomy and self-governance, allowing growth alongside future authorities. However, tension arose when Governor Philip Carteret, representing the proprietors, tried to assert full ownership, contradicting the Nichols-sanctioned patent. This conflict highlighted the clash between the original understanding of the land purchase and the evolving ambitions of colonial authorities. The Elizabethtown Associates, having purchased the land from the Lenape, honored their agreement authorized by Nichols and the Duke of York, asserting their right to acquire land rather than being granted land directly. The Duke of York had the right to redraw the borders to install proprietors. That did not give the proprietors the right to dispossess the associates, who were also bestowed the same land.
The eventual ruling was a shit show foreshadowing future furious follies, fomenting a final exit drifting chasm, one British, two American.
Cousin to proprietor Sir Carteret, appointed governor of New Jersey, Sir Philip Carteret, began his tenure granting land to his own associates and favorites, often overlapping with the land claimed by the Elizabethtown settlers. This created a great deal of confusion and resentment. Governor Carteret viewed the Nichols patent holders as essentially squatters, who were also not paying taxes on land they were using. His lords,
To uphold the spirit of early agreements. No, to uphold consistent practice on the world stage. Better, say what you want the British for all the foils that fall all men. Consistency abroad, a spirit shared fair for fair. To uphold a practical agreement as seen by three venture parties, the nature of which and corresponding actions of the acquisition determine the manner the Elizabethtown Tract entered within the New Jersey colony. By purchasing the land from an independent foreign nation, whom reasserted claim over borderlands with little or no Dutch presence. The Elizabethtown Associates were not granted land, they were granted the right to acquire land as a company on behalf of their lord. The Associates fully honored the agreement Sir Nichols enjoyed purvey to authorize by the king.
the Elizabethtown Associates, having purchased the land from the Lenape, honored their agreement authorized by Nichols and the Duke of York, asserting their right to acquire land rather than being granted land directly.
A magistrate's duty and service is to work to resolve such conflicting claims. Often conflicting decrees could be sorted out through appropriate compensation. This would uphold early agreements, aristocratic hierarchy, consistent practices, reflecting the spirit of fair and practical resolutions on the New World stage. However, New York and New Jersey spawned the ritualistic cultural wick-wagging tradition early, a practice from Liberty's most archaic bennies. Check the card on the top right to hear about one of them.